Hi, everybody. So nice to see you today. We have been reading from The Borrowers by Mary Norton, and today I will read chapter 19. And that, said Mrs. May, laying down her crochet hook, is really the end. Kate stared at her. Oh, it can't be, she gasped. Oh, please, please. The last square, said Mrs. May, smoothing it out on her knee. The 150th. Now we can sew them together. Oh, said Kate, breathing again. The quilt. I thought you meant the story. Well, it's the end of the story, too, said Mrs. May absently, or the beginning. He never saw them again. And she began to sort out the squares. But stammered Kate, you can't mean, it's not fair, she cried. It's cheating. It's. Tears sprang to her eyes. She threw her work down on the table and her crochet hook after it, and she kicked the bag of wools which lay beside her on the carpet. Why, Kate, why? Mrs. May looked genuinely surprised. Something more must have happened, cried Kate angrily. What about the rat catchers and the policeman and the... But something more did happen, said Mrs. May. A lot more happened. I'm going to tell you. Then why did you say it was the end? Because, said Mrs. May, she still looked surprised, he never saw them again. Then how can there be more? Because, said Mrs. May, there is more, a lot more. Kate glared at her. All right, she said, go on. Mrs. May looked back at her. Kate, she said after a moment, stories never really end. They can go on and on and on. It's just that sometimes at a certain point one stops telling them. But not at this kind of point, said Kate. Well, thread your needle, said Mrs. May, with gray wool this time, and we'll sew these squares together. I'll start at the top and you can start at the bottom. First a gray square, then an emerald, then a pink, and so on. Then you didn't really mean it, said Kate irritably, trying to push the folded wool through the narrow eye of the needle, when you said he never saw them again. Oh, but I did mean it, said Mrs. May. I'm telling you just what happened. He had to leave suddenly at the end of the week because there was a boat for India and a family who could take him. And for the 3 days before he left, they kept him locked up in those 2 rooms. For 3 days? Exclaimed Kate. Yes, Mrs. Driver, it seemed, told Aunt Sophie that he had a cold. She was determined, you see, to keep him out of the way until she got rid of the borrowers. And did she? Asked Kate. Did they all come? The policemen, the rat catchers, and the sanitary inspector didn't come, at least not while my brother was there. And they didn't have the rat catcher from the town hall, but they had a local man. The policeman came. Mrs. May laughed. During those days, Mrs. Driver used to give my brother a running commentary on what was going on below. She loved to grumble, and my brother, rendered harmless and shut away upstairs, became kind of neutral. She used to bring his meals up, and on that first morning she brought all the doll's furniture up on the breakfast tray and made my brother climb the shelves and put them back in the dollhouse. It was then she told him about the policeman. Furious, he said she was. Why? Asked Kate. Because the policeman turned out to be Nellie Runacre's son, Ernie, a boy Mrs. Driver had chased many a time for stealing russet apples from the tree by the gate. A nasty, thieving, good-for-nothing driven of a no-good, she told my brother. Sitting down there he is now in the kitchen, large as life, with his notebook out, laughing fit to burst. 21, he says he is now, and as cheeky as you make him. And was he? Asked Kate Round-Eye. A dribbit of no good? Of course not, any more than my brother was. Ernie Runacre was a fine, upstanding young man and a credit to the police force, and he did not actually laugh at Mrs. Driver when she told him her story, but he gave her what Cranford spoke of afterwards as an old-fashioned look when she described homily in bed. Take more water with it, it seemed to say. More water with what? Asked Kate. The fine old pale Madeira, I suppose, said Mrs. May. And Great Aunt Sophie had the same suspicion. She was furious when she heard that Mrs. Driver had seen several little people, when she herself, on a full decanter, had only risen to 1 or at most 2. Crampfurl had to bring all the Madeira up from the cellar and stack the cases against the wall in the corner of Aunt Sophie's bedroom, where, as she said, she could keep an eye on it. Did they get a cat? Asked Kate. Oh, yes, they did, but that wasn't much of a success either. It was Crampfurl's cat, a large yellow tom with white streaks on it. According to Mrs. Driver, it had only 2 ideas in its head, to get out of the house or into the larder. Talk of borrowers, Mrs. Driver would say as she slammed down the fish pie for my brother's luncheon. That cat's a borrower if ever there was one. Borrowed the fish, that cat did, and a good half bowl of egg sauce. But the cat wasn't there long. The first thing the rat catcher's terriers did was to chase it out of the house. There was a dreadful set to, my brother said. They chased it everywhere, upstairs, downstairs, in and out of the rooms, barking their heads off. The last glimpse my brother had of the cat was streaking away through the spiny and across the fields with terriers after it. Did they catch it? No, Mrs. May laughed. It was still there when I went a year later. A little morose, but fit as a fiddle. Tell about when you went. Oh, I wasn't there long, said Mrs. May rather hastily, and after that house was sold, my brother never went back. Kate stared at her suspiciously, pressing her needle against the center of her lowered lip. So they never caught the little people? She said at last. Mrs. May's eyes flicked away. No, they never actually caught them, but, she hesitated, as far as my poor brother was concerned, what they did do seemed even worse. What did they do? Mrs. May laid down her work and stared for a moment thoughtfully at her idle hands. I hated the rat catcher, she said suddenly. Why, did you know him? Everyone knew him. He had a walleye, and his name was Rich William. He was also the pig killer, and, well, he did other things as well. He had a gun, a hatchet, a spade, a pickaxe, and a contraption with bellows for smoking things out. I don't know what the smoke was exactly, poison fumes of some kind, which he made himself from herbs and chemicals. I only remember the smell of it. It clung around the barns or wherever he'd been. You can imagine what my brother felt on that third day, the smell he was leaving. When suddenly he smelled that smell. He was all dressed and ready to go. The bags were packed and down the hall. Mrs. Driver came and unlocked the door and took him down the passage to Aunt Sophie. He stood there stiff and pale, in gloves and overcoat beside the curtained bed. Seasick already? Aunt Sophie mocked him, peering down over the edge of the great mattress. No, he said. It's that smell. Aunt Sophie lifted her nose and she sniffed. What smell is it, Driver? It's the rat catcher, my lady, explained Mrs. Driver, reddening, down in the kitchen. What? Exclaimed Aunt Sophie. Are you smoking them out? And then she began to laugh. Oh, dear, she gasped. But if you don't like them, Driver, the remedy's simple. What is it, my lady? Asked Mrs. Driver coldly, but even her chins were red. Helpless with mirth, Aunt Sophie waved a ringed hand towards her. Her eyes were screwed up and her shoulders shaking. Keep the bottle corked, she managed at last, and motioned them weakly away. They heard her laughing still as they went on down the stairs. She don't believe in 'em, muttered Mrs. Driver, and she tightened her grip to my brother's arm. More fool her. She'll change her tune like enough when I take them up afterwards, laid out in sizes, on a clean piece of newspaper. And she dragged him roughly across the hall. The clock had been moved, exposing the wainscot, and as my brother saw at once, the hole had been blocked and sealed. The front door was open as usual, and the sunshine streamed in. The bag stood there beside the fiber mat, cooking a little in the golden warmth. The fruit trees beyond the bank had shed their petals and were lit with tender green, transparent in the sunlight. Plenty of time, said Mrs. Driver, glancing up at the clock. The cab's not due till 3:30. The clock stopped, said my brother. Mrs. Driver turned. She was wearing her hat and her best black coat, ready to take him to the station. She looked strange and tight and chapel-going, not a bit like Driver. So it has, she said. Her jaw dropped and her cheeks became heavy and pendulous. It's moving it, she decided after a moment. It'll be all right, she went on, once we get it back. Mr. Frith comes on Monday. And she dragged him again at his arm above the elbow. Where are we going? He asked, holding back. Along to the kitchen. We got a good 10 minutes. Don't you want to see him caught? No, he said, no, and he pulled away from her. Mrs. Driver stared at him, smiling a little. I do, she said. I'd like to see him close. He puffs the snuff in and they come running out. At least that's how it works with rats. But first, she says, you block up the exits. And her eyes followed his to the hole below the wainscot. How did they find it? The boy asked. Puttied it looked, with a square of brown paper pasted on crooked. Rich William found it. That's his job. They could unstick that, said the boy after a moment. Mrs. Driver laughed. Oh, no, they couldn't. Cemented, that is. A great big block of it right inside with a sheet of iron across the front of that old stove in the outhouse. He and Cranford had the morning room floor up to get at it. All Tuesday they was working, up till tea time. We aren't going to have no more carpets of that, capers of that kind, not under the clock. Once you get that clock back, it can't be moved again in a hurry. Not if you want to keep time, it can't. See where it stood, where the floor's washed away like? It was then my brother saw for the first and last time that raised platform of unscrubbed stone. Come on now, said Mrs. Driver, and took him by the arm. We'll hear the cab from the kitchen. But the kitchen, as she dragged him past the baize door, seemed to babble a sound. No approaching cab could be heard here, what with the yelps and barks and stampings and excited voices. Steady, 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 steady. Cranford was saying on one loud note as he held back the rat-catcher's terriers, which shrilled and panted on the leash. The policeman was there, Nellie Runacre's son Ernie. He had come out of interest and stood back from the others a little in view of his calling, with a cup of tea in his hand and his helmet pushed off his forehead. But his face was pink with boyish excitement, and as he stirred the teaspoon round and round, "Seein's believin'," he said cheerfully to Mrs. Driver when he saw her come in the door. A boy from the village was there with a ferret. It kept sort of pouring out of his pocket, my brother said, and the boy kept pushing it back. Rich William himself was crouched on the floor by the hole. He had lightened something beneath a piece of sacking, and the stench of its smoldering eddied around the room. He was working the bellows now with infinite care, stooping over them, rapt and tense. My brother stood there as if in a dream. Perhaps it was a dream, he said to me later, much later, after we were all grown up. He gazed around the kitchen. He saw the sunlit fruit trees through the window and a bough of the cherry tree which stood upon the bank. He saw the empty teacups on the table with spoons stuck in them and one without a saucer. He saw, propped against the wall close beside the baize door, the rat-catcher's belongings, a frayed coat patched with leather, a bundle of rabbit snares, 2 sacks, a spade, a gun, and a pickaxe. "Stand by now," Rich William was saying. And there was a rising note of excitement in his voice, but he did not turn his head. "Stand by, ready now to slip the dogs." Mrs. Driver let go of my brother's arm and moved towards the hole. "Keep back," said the rat catcher without turning. "Give us room." And Mrs. Driver backed nervously towards the table. She put a chair beside it and half raised one knee, but lowered it again when she caught Ernie Runacre's mocking glance. "All right, Ma," he said, cocking one eyebrow. "We'll give you a leg up when the time comes." And Mrs. Driver threw him a furious look. She snatched up 3 cups from the table and stumped away with them angrily into the scullery. "Seamless smooch of a something or other," my brother heard her mutter as she brushed past him. And at those words, suddenly my brother came to life. He threw a thick glance around the kitchen. The men were absorbed. All eyes were on the rat catcher, except for those of the village boy, who was getting out his ferret. Stealthily, my brother drew off his gloves and began to move backwards, slowly towards the green baize door. And as he moved, gently stuffing his gloves into his pocket, he kept his eyes on the group around the hole. He paused a moment beside the rat-catcher's tools and stretched out a wary, groping hand. His fingers closed at last on the wooden handle. Smooth it was, worn with wear. He glanced down quickly to make sure. Yes, it was as he hoped, the pickaxe. He leaned back a little and pushed almost imperceptibly against the door with his shoulders. It opened sweetly in its silent way. Not one of them men had looked up. "Steady now," the rat catcher was saying, stooping closely over the bellows. "It takes a moment to go right through. There ain't much ventilation, not under a floor." My brother slid through the barely open door and it sighed to behind him, closing out the noise. He took a few steps on tiptoe down the dark kitchen passage, and then he ran. There was the hall again, steeped in sunshine, with his bags beside the door. He bumped against the clock, and it struck a note, a trembling note, urgent and deep. He raised the pickaxe to the height of his shoulders and aimed a sideways blow at the hole below the wainscot. The paper tore, a few crumbles of plaster fell out, and the pickaxe rebounded sharply, jarring his hands. There was indeed iron behind the cement, something immovable. Again he struck, and again, and again. The wainscot above the hole became split and scratched, and the paper hung down in strips. But still the pickaxe bounced. It was no good. His hands, wet with sweat, were sliding and slipping out of the wood. He paused for breath, and looking out, he saw the cab. He saw it on the road, beyond the hedge at the far side of the orchard. Soon it would reach the russet apple tree beside the gate. Soon it would turn into the drive. He glanced up at the clock. It was ticking steadily, the result perhaps of his knock. The sound gave him comfort and steadied his thumping heart. Time. That's what he needed. A little more time. It takes a moment, like, the rat catcher had said, to go right through. There ain't much ventilation, not under a floor. Ventilation, that was the word, the saving word. Pickaxe in hand, my brother ran out of the door. He stumbled upon the gravel path and nearly fell. The pickaxe handle came up and struck him a sharp blow in the temple. Already when he reached it, a thin filament of smoke was eddying out of the graving, and he thought as he ran towards it there was a flicker of movement against the darkness between the bars. And that was where they would be, of course, to get the air. But he did not stop to make sure. Already he heard behind him the crunch of wheels on the gravel and the sound of the horse's hooves. He was not, as I have told you, a very strong little boy, and he was only 9, not 10 as he boasted to Arietti. But with 2 great blows on the brickwork, he dislodged one end of the grating. It fell down sideways, slightly on a slant, hanging, it seemed, by one nail. Then he clambered up the bank and threw the pickaxe with all of his might into the long grass beyond the cherry tree. He remembered thinking, as he stumbled back, sweaty and breathless, towards the cab, how that, too, the loss of the pickaxe, would cause its own kind of trouble later. And if you see here, that's the broken grating. And then there's another picture. And this is all of the crazy mayhem going on in the kitchen, trying to get rid of the borrowers. And the only chapter left is chapter 20, and it really is a very short chapter, so I'll tell you what, I'm going to go for it. But, exclaimed Kate, didn't he see them come out? No, Mrs. Driver came along then in a fury of annoyance because they were late for the train. See, she bustled them into the cab because she wanted to get back, and she said as fast as she could to be in at the death. Driver was like that. Kate was silent for a moment, looking down. So that is the end, she said at last. Yes, said Mrs. May. It could be, or the beginning. But, Kate raised a worried face, perhaps they didn't escape through the grating. Oh, they escaped all right, said Mrs. May lightly. But how do you know? I just know, said Mrs. May. But how did they get across those fields with the cows and things and the crows? They walked, I suppose. The Hendreries did it. People can do anything when they have a mind to. But poor Homily, she'd be so upset. Yes, she was upset, said Mrs. May. And how would they know the way? By the gas pump pipe, said Mrs. May. There's a kind of bridge all along through the spiny and across the fields, you see. When men dig a trench and put a pipe in it, all the earth they've dug out doesn't quite fit when they put it back. The ground looks different. But poor Homily, she didn't have her tea or her furniture or carpets or anything. Do you suppose they took anything? Oh, people always grab something, said Mrs. May shortly. The honest things sometimes, if you've read about shipwrecks. She spoke hurriedly, as though she were tired of the subject. Do be careful, child. Not gray next to pink. You have to unpick it. But, went on Kate in a despairing voice as she picked up the scissors, Homily would hate to arrive there all poor and destitute in front of Loopy. Destitute, said Mrs. May patiently. And Loopy wasn't there, remember? Loopy never came back, and you know what Homily would do. Can't you see her? She would be in her element. She would tie on her apron at once and cry, those poor silly men, and she'd bustle and fuss and cook and clean and make them wipe their feet when they came in. On what? Asked Kate. On a piece of moss, of course, laid down by the door. Were they all boys? Asked Kate after a moment. Yes, harpsichords and clocks, and they would spoil Arietti dreadfully. Well, what did they eat? Did they eat caterpillars, do you think? Oh, goodness, child, of course they didn't. They had a wonderful life, all that Arietti ever dreamed of. They could live very well. Badger sets are almost like villages, full of passages and chambers and storehouses. They could gather hazelnuts and beechnuts and chestnuts. They could gather corn, which they could store and grind into flour, just as humans do. It was all there for them. They didn't even have to plant it. They had honey. They could make elderflower tea and lime tea. They had hips and haws and blackberries and sloes and wild strawberries. The boys could fish in the stream, and minnow to them would be as big as a mackerel to you. They had birds' eggs, any amount of them, for custards and cakes and omelets. You see, they would know where to look for things, and they had greens and salads, of course. Think of a salad made of those tender shoots of young hawthorn, bread and cheese, we used to call it, with sorrel and dandelion and a sprinkle of thyme and wild garlic. Homily was a good cook, remember? It wasn't for nothing that the clocks have lived under the kitchen. But the danger, cried Kate. The weasels, the crows, and the stoats, and all those things. Oh, yes, agreed Mrs. May. Of course there was danger. There's danger everywhere, but no more than for many human beings. At least they didn't have wars. And what about the early settlers in America and those people who farm in the middle of big game country in Africa and the edge of the jungles in India? They get to know the habits of the animals. Few animals kill for the sake of killing. Even rabbits know when a fox isn't hunting, and they will run quite near him when he's full fed and lazing in the sun. These were boys, remember? They would learn to hunt for the pot and how to protect themselves. I don't suppose Arietti and Homily would wander far afield. Arietti would, said Kate. Yes, agreed Mrs. May, laughing. I suppose Arietti might. So they would have meat, said Kate. Yes, sometimes, but burrowers are burrowers, not killers, I think, said Mrs. May. That if a stoat, say, killed a partridge, they would borrow a leg. And if a fox killed a rabbit, they'd use the fur? Yes, for rugs and things. Supposing, said Kate, when they had a little roast, they skinned haws and baked them. Would they taste like brown potatoes? Perhaps, said Mrs. May. But they couldn't cook in the Badger set. I suppose they cooked out of doors. How would they keep them in the winter? Do you know what I think? Said Mrs. May, and she laid down her work and leaned forward a little. I think they didn't live in the Badger set at all. I think they used it with its passages and storerooms as a great honeycomb of an entrance hall. None but they would know the secret way through the tunnels which led to their home. Borrowers love passages, and they love gates, and they love to live a long way from their own front doors. Where would they live then? I was wondering, said Mrs. May, about the gas pipe. Oh, yes, cried Kate. I see what you mean. The soil's all soft and sandy up there. I think they'd go right through the Badger set and dig out a circular chamber level with the gas pipe. And off this chamber, all around it, there'd be little rooms like cabins. And I think, said Mrs. May, that they'd bore 3 little pinholes in the gas pipe. One would be so tiny that you could hardly see it, and one would be always alight. The other 2 would have stoppers in them, which, when they wanted to light the gas, they would pull out. They would light the bigger ones from the small burner. That's where they'd cook, and that would give them light. But would they be so clever? Oh, but they are clever, Mrs. May assured her. Very clever, much too clever to live near a gas pipe and not use it. They're borrowers, remember? But they'd want a little air hole. Oh, said Mrs. May quickly, they did have one. How do you know? Asked Kate. Because once when I was up there, I smelled hot pot. Oh, cried Kate excitedly. She twisted around and knelt on the hassock. So you did go up there. That's how you know. You saw them too. Oh, no, said Mrs. May, drawing back a little in her chair. I never saw them. Never. But you went up there. You know something. I can see you know. Yes, I went up there. Mrs. May stared back into Kate's eager face. Hesitant, she seemed, almost a little guilty. Well, she conceded at last, I'll tell you for what it's worth. When I went to stay in that house, it was just before Aunt Sophie went into the nursing home. I knew the place was going to be sold, so again, Mrs. May hesitated almost shyly. Well, I took all the furniture out of the doll's house and put it in a pillowcase and took it up there. I bought things too out of my pocket money, tea and coffee beans and salt and pepper and cloves and a great big packet of lump sugar. And I took the whole lot of little pieces in silk, which were over from making a patchwork quilt. And I took them some fish bones for needles. And I took the tiny thimble I got in the Christmas pudding and a whole collection of scraps and cracker things I had in a chocolate box. But you never saw them? No, I never saw them. I sat for hours against the bank, against the hawthorn hedge. It was a lovely bank twined with twisted hawthorn roots and riddled with sandy holes. And there were wood violets and primroses and early champion. From the top of the bank, you could see the miles across the fields, and you could see the woods and the valleys and the twisting lanes, and you could see the chimneys of the house. Perhaps it was the wrong place. I don't think so. Sitting there in the grass, half dreaming and watching beetles and ants, I found the oak tree, the oak apple. It was smooth and polished and dry, and there was a hole born on one side of it and a slice off the top. The teapot, exclaimed Kate. I think so. I looked everywhere, but I couldn't find the quill spout. I called down all those holes, as my brother had done, but no one answered. Next day when I went up there, the pillowcase had gone. And everything in it? Yes, everything. I searched the ground for yards around in case there might be a scrap of silk or a coffee bean, but there was nothing. Of course, somebody passing might have picked it up and carried it away. That was the day, said Mrs. May, smiling, that I smelled hot pot. And which was the day, asked Kate, that you found Ariette's diary? Mrs. May laid down her work. Kate, she began in a startled voice, and then uncertainly she smiled. What makes you say that? Her cheeks had become quite pink. I guess, said Kate. I knew there was something you wouldn't tell me, like reading somebody else's diary. It wasn't the diary, said Mrs. May hastily, but her cheeks had become even pinker. It was the book called Memoranda, and the book with blank pages. That's where she'd written it, and it wasn't on the day I found it, but 3 weeks later, the day before I left. Kate sat silent, staring at Mrs. May, and after a while she drew a long breath. Then that proves it, she said finally. Underground chamber and all. Not quite, said Mrs. May. Why not? Asked Kate. Ariette used to make her E's like little half moons with a stroke in the middle. Well, said Kate. Mrs. May laughed and took up her work again. My brother did too, she said. The end. So that is the end of The Borrowers. And if you like The Borrowers, there are sequels to this book that you can get from the library once we open again. There's also a movie that was made, I wouldn't say sometime in the 90s based on this book, but I'm going to be honest with you, it doesn't really stick to the original. And when I saw it, I didn't really like it. But then there's a new animated version. Well, this one came out, I would say about 8 years ago, called The Secret of Ariette, and that was excellent. So see that one. The live action Borrowers, I think you could probably take a pass on, but see The Secret of Ariette that's animated and is wonderful. Okay, everybody, thank you so much for joining me with the reading of The Borrowers, and I can't wait to see everyone very soon at the library. Please take care, and I miss you all. Bye.